This was in the middle 30s, and they just didn't know this career type thing that I was doing. And they'd say, a woman's coming in to direct a play. Well, see, when I'd come in, they took it for granted.
She had 3 minutes. That was it. A borrowed slot at the tail end of a radio broadcast in November of 1940, wearing a costume she'd sewn together herself with the price tag still hanging off the hat. She hollered one word, and a country fell in love with a woman who did not exist. The real one standing under that straw hat had a college education, a taste for classical music, and a home so refined her own neighbors could not picture her within a mile of the character she was about to become. For 50 years, almost no one found out which version was real. Here's the woman underneath the hat. The night a borrowed 3 minutes changed everything. Nashville, the War Memorial Auditorium, the last half hour of the Grand Ole Opry broadcast, its 50,000-watt signal already carrying every note out across more than 30 states. A 28-year-old woman waits in the wings wearing a cheap yellow dress and cotton stockings. A wide straw hat trimmed with paper flowers pinned on top, the cardboard price tag still swinging from the brim. Nobody in the audience has heard her name. She has exactly 3 minutes to change that. She walks out, throws up one hand, and shouts a single word at the top of her lungs. "Howdy?" The crowd comes apart laughing before she says another word. Within days, sacks of fan mail start arriving at the radio station, more than almost any other performer on the entire program receives. Letters from farmhouses and front porches across more than 30 states, all of them carried by a 50,000-watt signal into the dark. A character who will belong to America for the next 50 years has just been born on a slot nobody expected to matter. The woman under that hat was named Sarah Ophelia Colley, and almost nothing about her matched the character she'd just handed to the world. The role was a boy-crazy country spinster from a made-up place called Grinder's Switch, a woman who could not land a husband and could not stop talking about it, dime store dress and all. Sarah Colley was the daughter of a wealthy family, a finishing school graduate, and a trained dramatic actress who loved poetry and had come to Nashville dreaming of serious theater, not a hillbilly stage. For the next 50 years, she would put that hat back on several nights a week and become someone she was not. The whole country would fall for the invention without ever quite meeting the person who built it. So who was she, really, behind the price tag and the grin? That question starts somewhere nobody would expect. A big house on the good street in a town of only a few hundred people. The house that never once produced a hillbilly. Centerville, Tennessee. The years leading up to 1912. Thomas Colley owns the local lumber business and is one of the most prosperous men in Hickman County, a sawmill operator and timber dealer whose name carried real weight in a town this small. His wife, Fanny, is a finishing school graduate herself, an accomplished pianist who plays for recitals and amateur plays at the local opera house and stands among the town's social leaders. On the 25th of October, 1912, their fifth daughter arrives, a surprise baby born to a mother already 37 years old, with 4 girls already in school. A late addition to a household that had assumed its family was already complete. Centerville itself counted only a few hundred residents, and the Colleys sat comfortably near the top of that small world. Fanny made sure all 5 girls were raised with music, books, and proper manners, the standard education for daughters of a leading family in that era. There was nothing hillbilly about the house Sarah grew up in. She was doted on by 4 older sisters, passed around like a favorite doll, so thoroughly spoiled by the attention that her father took to calling her the general manager of the household. The Colleys sat near the top of a very small town, and Sarah was raised to match that position exactly. Music lessons, proper manners, books, the particular kind of polish a prosperous small-town family bought for its daughters in the early 20th century. She looked at the country people who farmed the hills around Hickman County the way any well-bred town child of that era did, as an outsider looking in, curious but distant. She preferred classical music to anything else, and when a traveling vaudeville show passed through a Nashville theater, and she watched a comic playing a broad country character bring the house down, something caught in her that she couldn't yet explain. She had no way of knowing she'd just watched the rough outline of her own future cross a stage in front of her years before she'd ever consider stepping onto one herself in anything but a serious role. Her full name tells you what kind of household raised her. Sarah Ophelia Colley, a proper, old-fashioned name, the kind a family gives a daughter it has real plans for, chosen with the same care Fanny and Thomas brought to every other decision about how their 5 girls would be raised. Nobody in that house was making plans that involved a place called Grinder's Switch. That's the first thing to understand about the woman behind Minnie Pearl. Long before the hat and the price tag, she was a child of privilege being carefully raised to be a lady. And every single thing about that upbringing was about to collide with a decision that made almost no sense to anyone who knew her. The school built to erase everything she'd become. Around 1930, fresh out of high school, Sarah's family sent her to Ward Belmont College in Nashville, at the time the most prestigious finishing school for young ladies in the entire state. This wasn't a small expense. The Colleys had taken real losses in the Great Depression, and they scraped together the tuition anyway to send their youngest daughter to the best school they could find. She majored in what the school called expression, drama, dance, stagecraft, the whole apparatus a family bought to turn a bright girl into a cultured woman. There was just one problem. Audiences kept laughing at her even when she was dead serious. She could not deliver a dramatic monologue without getting a laugh somewhere she hadn't intended one, a pattern that frustrated her far more than it amused her at the time. She'd later admit that even her most earnest performances somehow landed as comedy, no matter how hard she tried to play them straight. It was a gift she hadn't asked for, and she spent years actively resisting it. At Ward Belmont, she was drilled in diction and poise and classical theater, trained to speak in the careful, rounded cadence of Nashville gentry, a voice about as far as it's possible to get from the one that would eventually make her famous. Everything about that education pointed toward the drawing room and the legitimate stage. Nothing in it pointed toward a cornfield, and nobody standing in that classroom, least of all Sarah herself, could have guessed how completely that training was about to be set aside. After graduating around 1932, she went home to Centerville and did what a well-bred young woman of her era was expected to do while she waited for her real life to start. She taught dance, drama, and piano to local children. Custom held that a woman shouldn't travel alone until she turned 21. So for 2 long years, she taught other people's children and dreamed of a stage far bigger than Hickman County had to offer, certain that Broadway or something close to it was still waiting somewhere down the road. She was completely certain her future belonged to serious theater. She was completely wrong. Everything her upbringing had built her to become was about to get thrown away on purpose, several nights a week, for the rest of her life. And the character waiting for her wasn't in a Nashville playhouse at all. It was on a back road in Alabama, the road that quietly rebuilt her from the inside out. 1934. Sarah Colley signs on with the Wayne P. Sewell Production Company, a touring theatrical outfit out of Atlanta, and becomes a traveling director, 22 years old, and further from a Nashville drawing room than she'd ever imagined being. On paper, it looked like a step down from the stage career she'd wanted. In practice, it sent her into hundreds of small towns across Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas, staging amateur plays and musicals with local church groups and civic clubs, coaching farmers' wives and shopkeepers through their 3 nights of glory on a schoolhouse stage. It was Depression-era work, promoting the company's shows through civic organizations and Lions Club meetings in town after town, the kind of grinding, unglamorous circuit few finishing school graduates ever chose voluntarily. Her family was not thrilled. For a Colley daughter to go into show business at all was close to a scandal, and this was show business of the humblest kind. Sleeping in boarding houses and spare rooms, moving on every couple of weeks, packing costumes into trunks too heavy to lift alone, and hauling them to the next train depot. But it put her directly among the people she'd spend the rest of her life bringing to a stage, and she came to genuinely love them. For 6 years, she lived out of a suitcase, moving through hundreds of towns, staying in the homes of local families because there was often nowhere else to stay. She sat at their supper tables and listened to their talk, and the girl who once regarded country people as outsiders quietly stopped being one herself. She wasn't studying them for material. She was simply falling for them, gathering stories and songs and impressions along the way with no particular purpose in mind. And the character that eventually came out of it carried every bit of that affection. Around 1936, while staging a musical in the small community of Baileyton, Alabama, up on Sand Mountain, Sarah found herself without proper lodging arrangements and accepted an invitation from a kind mountain family to share their small cabin for the night. There she got to know an older woman, a warm, funny woman in her 70s, with a thick country accent and an endless supply of stories, a saying for every occasion, a laugh that filled the whole cabin. Sarah could have listened to her talk all night, and she later credited that single evening as the true origin of everything that followed. She was charmed enough to start gathering the woman up into a character, folding in pieces of dozens of other rural people she'd met along the way on the same circuit. Minnie Pearl was never really one woman. She was a loving composite, stitched together out of a mountain grandmother in Baileyton and 100 other people who had fed a young touring director and put her up for the night when the schoolhouse stage went dark. What happened next wasn't planned at all. It was an accident with a price tag that Sarah was smart enough not to fix. The price tag she forgot to remove. She tried the character out for the first time in 1939 at a women's club banquet in Aiken, South Carolina. She needed a costume, so she ran to a downtown department store and bought a cheap straw hat to finish the look. In her hurry, she left the price tag hanging from the brim. During the act, it slipped into view, $1.98 dangling in front of the whole room, and the audience roared. It wasn't a planned gag. It was a mistake she kept on purpose, and that hat never came off again for the rest of her career. The character caught on well enough that Sarah began billing herself as Minnie Pearl, and slowly the invented spinster started crowding out the woman who'd created her, because audiences wanted Minnie, not a drama coach named Miss Collie. A shift that happened gradually enough that Sarah barely noticed it taking hold until the character's name was the only one bookers cared about anymore. The following year, 1940, she performed the character at a bankers' convention back home in Centerville, and a couple of executives from WSM Radio happened to be sitting in the room. They thought she was hilarious and offered her a spot on the Grand Ole Opry. They were also nervous about it. The men running the show worried their largely rural audience might take offense at a woman standing up and playing a country hick, unsure listeners would understand she was laughing along with them rather than down at them. So they gave her a cautious 3 minutes near the end of the broadcast and waited to see what happened. She almost turned the audition down entirely, still holding on to some hope that serious theater might still be waiting for her somewhere down the line. And it took real convincing from people who'd seen the character land with a live crowd to get her onto that stage at all. The gap between the woman still quietly hoping for Broadway and the character about to make her a household name had never felt wider than it did backstage that night. What happened was the fan mail, arriving faster than for almost anyone else on the program, and it settled the question overnight. The audience the Opry brass had worried about offending had instead taken her straight to their hearts. They didn't feel mocked. They felt seen. Sarah Collie became a permanent fixture of the Opry and its first great solo female star, and Roy Acuff, already the biggest name in country music, was taken enough with the act to sign her onto his own traveling roadshow, starting a friendship that would anchor the Opry for the next 50 years. WSM's signal was one of the most powerful in the country, carrying into farmhouses from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf on a clear night, which meant Minnie Pearl wasn't a local act anymore. She was suddenly a voice in living rooms across half the nation, a friend who dropped by every Saturday to bring news from a hometown that had never actually existed, and listeners who had never once set foot in Tennessee began writing in as though Grinder's Switch were a real place they'd simply never had the chance to visit. That success bought Sarah something she hadn't quite bargained for: two entirely separate lives running in Nashville at the very same time. Two women sharing one Nashville. By 1943, the Opry had moved into the Ryman Auditorium, the old brick tabernacle in downtown Nashville that would become its most famous home. And Minnie Pearl played that stage week after week for decades, carrying the character out on the road the rest of each year on the same buses and trains as the singers. She sharpened every detail, naming Minnie's hometown Grinder's Switch after a real railroad switching station near her father's old lumberyard, building out running gags about her endless, doomed hunt for a husband. It looked artless. It wasn't. Sarah worked for hours to get a single line reading exactly right, treating a hillbilly joke with the same discipline her Ward Belmont teachers had once brought to serious drama. Everything about the character was a decision. The dress homemade-looking but never shabby. The voice broad but never cruel. There was one rule she held to for 50 years, without ever once breaking it. Minnie Pearl was never the butt of the joke. The audience laughed with her, at her own vanity and her own hopeless romances, never at the country people she'd once lived among on the road. That distance was the entire difference between cruelty and love, and Sarah understood exactly how easily her act could have tipped the wrong way if she'd let it. She once said plainly that she understood why other women comedians of her era avoided getting down on the level of a foolish country girl, and that she'd chosen to get down on that level anyway, as a friend, rather than someone looking to score an easy laugh at a stranger's expense. In 1947, she married Henry Cannon, a former Army Air Corps pilot who ran a successful charter service flying country stars, including Hank Williams and later Elvis Presley, to their shows. Henry became her manager and personal pilot at once, flying her to one-night stands all week and always getting her back to Nashville in time for Saturday's broadcast, a punishing schedule the two of them kept up for decades without complaint. Even her own husband mostly just called her Minnie. Offstage, she was Mrs. Henry Cannon, a gracious hostess, a competitive tennis player at the country club, a pillar of Brentwood Methodist Church, where she donated the pipe organ. In 1969, she and Henry bought a home on Curtiswood Lane, directly next door to the Tennessee governor's mansion. And sitting governors were regular guests at her table, a level of social standing the character she played on Saturday nights could never have imagined for herself. Nashville in those years was fighting a quiet identity war between its old social elite and the country music business the newspapers dismissively called hillbilly heaven. Most people belonged firmly to one camp or the other. Sarah Cannon belonged to both, moving between drawing rooms and the Opry stage without ever fully leaving either one. And by simply being herself in both places, she softened the divide between them more than almost anyone else in the city managed to. That balancing act held for decades, right up until her own body forced a kind of honesty even Minnie Pearl couldn't perform her way around. There was more to her Nashville life than tennis and church socials, too. At Henry's suggestion, she eased off the relentless road schedule for stretches at a time and poured the freed-up hours into charity work, lending her name to the Children's Hospital, the Heart Association, and the Cancer Society across the city. The same society that had once been faintly scandalized by a collie girl going into show business came, in time, to count her as one of Nashville's finest citizens. Won over not because she hid Minnie away, but because offstage she was so plainly generous that nobody could hold the hat against her for long. In 1965, the city named her its Woman of the Year, an honor from the very establishment that had once quietly disapproved of her choice of career. The diagnosis she carried alone under the lights. 1985, at the height of nearly 45 years of constancy, Sarah Cannon was diagnosed with breast cancer. In the decades before that diagnosis, the character had only grown larger. A 1969 television show called Hee Haw introduced Minnie Pearl to an entirely new generation, and for more than 20 years, children who had never once heard the Opry on the radio grew up watching her on television every week, hat and price tag and all. In 1975 came an honor that mattered more than almost any other. Sarah Cannon was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, the first woman ever inducted primarily as a comedian, standing shoulder to shoulder with the singers and songwriters she'd shared a stage with for decades. That same year, the National Conference of Christians and Jews gave her its Brotherhood Award, a recognition not of the comedy, but of the character of the woman underneath it. She was in her early 70s, the one performer in America audiences could always count on to walk out glad to be alive. And now she was facing the exact thing that frightens everyone. She went through radiation and a double mastectomy, and she handled it the way she handled anything painful. Privately, entirely out of the audience's sight. The country that tuned in every week to hear Minnie holler how proud she was to be there never saw the fear, never saw a single treatment, never saw one crack in the cheerfulness. What the fans got was joy. What Sarah carried during those years was her own mortality, quietly, alone. Consider what that actually took. She was in her 70s. She'd just lost both breasts to cancer. She was going through radiation, and she was still walking out under Opry lights to tell a laughing crowd how happy she was to be there. The character's entire job was happiness, and she did that job through the most frightening stretch of her life without letting the mask slip once. But she didn't carry the weight only for herself. She turned the hardest thing that had ever happened to her into a mission, becoming a public spokeswoman for early cancer detection, urging women across the country to get the screenings that had caught her own cancer in time. In 1987, she received the Courage Award from the American Cancer Society and the Pioneer Award from the Academy of Country Music the same year, honors that recognized a fight the public had barely glimpsed while it was happening. She put her real name behind the cause at last, funding a foundation for research and allowing the Nashville Medical Center that treated her to rename its cancer program in her honor. A center that has since grown into hospitals across multiple states. Countless women are alive today because a comedian used her own frightening diagnosis to warn them not to wait. It might be the most quietly heroic thing she ever did, and for a woman who'd spent 50 years promising nothing but happiness from that stage, it revealed a kind of courage her audience never once suspected was underneath the act. That final act of quiet heroism couldn't hold off what was coming for much longer. The silence that finally came, and what it left behind. Sarah kept performing after the cancer, kept walking out in the hat, kept the promise going, touring the biggest stages in the country and the smallest county fairs with exactly the same level of commitment she'd always brought to both. But her body was setting a limit. Her will couldn't talk its way past. In June of 1991, she suffered a stroke. It ended her career instantly. After more than 50 years, the loudest, warmest, most reliable greeting in American radio simply went quiet, and she never performed again. It's hard to overstate what that silence actually meant. For 51 years, across the entire arc of modern country music, Minnie Pearl had been the one constant, the greeting that opened the show and the warmth that held the whole thing together. She'd outlasted nearly everyone, and then, in a single month, she was gone from the stage for good, with no one able to step into the role because there had only ever been one of her. What looked, week after week for half a century, like a fixed and permanent part of American life, turned out to have been carried the entire time by one particular woman's stamina. And once that stamina ran out, there was no understudy waiting in the wings to take her place. The following year, 1992, brought another loss when Roy Acuff, the friend who'd signed her to his roadshow back in 1940 and stood beside her at the Opry's center for half a century, died. Sarah spent her final years in declining health, cared for quietly away from the spotlight, her sharp and cultured mind slowly slipping behind the fog a stroke leaves in its wake. The same mind that had once memorized dramatic monologues at Ward Belmont, now navigating a much harder script with no audience watching at all. In late February of 1996, she was admitted to a Nashville hospital, and on the 4th of March, 1996, Sarah Ophelia Collier Cannon died of complications from her stroke at 83 years old. She was laid to rest at Mount Hope Cemetery in nearby Franklin, Tennessee, under her own name, the one the country had never really learned. Henry Cannon, the pilot who'd spent half a century keeping her in the air, followed her the next year. When a public figure lives in front of an audience for 50 years, people tend to go looking for the rot underneath, the secret that finally explains everything. With Sarah Cannon, there's simply nothing like that to find. No scandal, no bitter feud, no hidden cruelty behind the kindness. What reporters found instead, every time they went looking for a gap between the public performer and the private woman, was someone every bit as generous off-camera as the character the whole country loved. Backstage, out of the hat, she was known as the warm center of the Opry family, gracious to the biggest stars and, more tellingly, to the youngest and greenest performers terrified to be there for the first time. The kind of person who could find the most frightened newcomer in any room and make them feel like they belonged within a minute or two. The woman who never had children of her own became, in a real sense, a kind of mother to an entire institution. And in a business not exactly famous for its kindness, almost nobody who met her backstage ever came away with a bad word to say. The real secret of her double life turned out to be the gentlest one imaginable. A refined, generous woman invented a hillbilly and protected her for 50 straight years, using the character only to make strangers feel welcome, never once to make anyone feel small. The distance between the girl from the big house in Centerville and the spinster from Grinder's Switch was never really a gap she was hiding. It was a bridge she spent her entire life quietly building, one Saturday broadcast at a time, so that a country full of strangers would always have one voice, one hat, and one price tag that felt exactly like home. She used to close her act by telling the crowd she loved them so much it hurt. And by every account that reached beyond the stage lights, she meant it completely, both halves of herself, for the whole 50 years. If the woman behind Minnie Pearl carried a cancer diagnosis through years of live performances without her audience ever noticing a single crack in the act, what other quiet courage do you think has gone unnoticed behind the entertainers you grew up watching? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.